seconds. Good afternoon and welcome to San Mateo Arboretum Society's Zoom seminar, Edible Container Gardening. The program will last approximately 90 minutes and it will be recorded. My name is Pat Paquette. I'm on the Education Committee and also a greenhouse volunteer. Feel free to submit questions via the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. We'll hold questions until the end. At the speaker's request. A few days after the presentation, you'll be emailed a link to the recording and a link to an evaluation form, and we appreciate all your feedback. Before we start, a little bit of information about what's happening at the Arboretum. Our nursery in San Mateo Central Park is open 11 to 2 on Saturdays and Sundays. Entry is at the North Gate. Payment is by credit or debit card and Apple Pay. No cash accepted. Check our website, sanmateoarboretum.org, or call 650-579-0536 for updated information. While you're in Central Park, visit the Rose Garden, the Butterfly Hummingbird Garden, and our new demonstration gardens. All these gardens are maintained by Arboretum Society volunteers. In addition, currently there's an outdoor art exhibit open 10 to 3 Friday through Sunday in the Arboretum's Victorian Garden. Currently, there's a show entitled Honeybee Art Show, and it features art by the San Mateo High School students. Today's workshop presenter is Laurel Nagle. Laurel is a professional gardener and the owner of Every Bloomin Thing, a subscription container gardening service providing seasonal color to homes and businesses along the peninsula. She has been a master gardener since 2009 and has a landscape architecture degree from UC Berkeley Extension. Laurel has given presentations throughout the Bay Area on various aspects of container gardening, as well as edible gardening, beginner basics, and seasonal planting design. She has also taught gardening to school children. I will now turn it over to Laurel.
Oh, great. Well, welcome and thank you. Kevin, I messed up my thing. Can I just move this and get my presentation going? Okay, I'm going to say yes to that. Let me just get started. So this is it's titled How to Grow Almost Everything or Anything in a Pot, because generally if you're going to grow vegetables, the principles are the same as mostly flowers, trees, bushes. And in fact, with edible containers, you can grow blueberry bushes, you can grow, citrus in containers. So these are the guidelines to get you through all of this. And I hope that I've given you enough detail, but I will stay for any questions if you have them afterwards. So, advantages of container gardening. There are many, but one, it can go anywhere. You could, put them on a wall, in your garden, if you've got a space in your border that's a great place with sun and access to water. If you don't have any access to a garden on your balcony, they're really easy to change. It's not a big effort. You don't have to worry if your soil is contaminated or has too much clay or drains too fast. You don't have a problem with gophers, which at the moment I am struggling with. And actually, if you grow your summer vegetables in containers, you usually can start them sooner than people who have to wait for the ground to warm up. Additionally, you may live in a neighborhood that's too cool for certain things, but maybe you've got, and I'll show this later, a warm little corner where there's lots of reflected sun. In those cases, your zone's a little warmer in that little microcosm than it is elsewhere. You can take advantage and maybe grow peppers or bigger tomatoes. So that's something to consider too. As I said, the steps are the same, whether it's indoor, outdoor, succulents. So, the first thing, I don't have a really glamorous first page of the elements, but I kind of do something with kids. What do plants need to grow? And it's, sun, space, dirt, soil, is what we call it in the gardening industry, air and water. That's what they need to grow. If you really want them to thrive, in addition, you need to understand your space and is it the right place for those things to grow? And what do the plants need? Do they need a little extra fertilizer? Do they need support? So that's the little extra bit of homework that's going to get you a really big, happy crop versus just a few, skinny little peppers or tomatoes. This, I think, is actually the most important and probably the thing people don't really do, but is to get to know where you're going to put them. Is there sun? Is there shade? And for how many hours? And what's shady in, January, February might be very sunny in June, or vice versa. What's sunny in January and February is now shady because either the sun is up over an awning or a tree is leafed out. So you kind of want to pay attention to that. And also the orientation of the sun. Are you facing south, east, north? Consider the wind. We've had some really bad winds the last couple of days, at least where I live in San Mateo, which actually dried out. I had some tomato seedlings and I found them limp out there. So you want to make sure that you have some wind protection. I always think stone, concrete, like driveways or stucco homes or a stone wall are all bonuses for growing vegetables or fruits in the summer because they radiate heat at night. Consider your unwanted guests. Deer are a problem no matter what. Raccoons are less of an issue. They're just kind of a nuisance. Rabbits, if the container is low, will sometimes get into it. Squirrels, they're a pain everywhere, but I talk a little bit later about some things I do. You also want to think about foot traffic. If your containers are going to be right near where lots of people are walking by, it may be that you never get to see the lovely succulent strawberries you've been trying to grow or your perfect tomatoes. If a lot of random people walk by, they may decide that's like welcoming them to join in your harvest. Water, you need to have water available. You have to decide, are you going to hand water? Are you going to set up irrigation? And are you going to be committed to it? And if you have a balcony or you're on a roof garden, you need to think about maximum weight. I'm afraid I don't know the mathematics. I know that a gallon of water weighs about 8 pounds and wet soil is very heavy. There are some pots that can weigh a couple 100 pounds if you get those big concrete. Actually, they don't even have to be that big, but those concrete ornate ones. So those are all things you should think about. And this is sort of an example of what a microclimate is when I talk about it. I mean, it's the same yard, it's the same zone, in Sunset, maybe zone 16, and USDA, we're like 10A or 9B, it kind of depends. But on this side, where the sun reflects off the stone here, and that heat is there, that's a much warmer area than the cool side, where the shade is cast. And it means different things like I mean, I think the sunny side for vegetables, that's the plus, but there are other things to consider in general with gardening. The sunny side heat is going to cause more evaporation, so you're going to have to water more often. And then on the shady side, you might be able to grow in the summer some things that really are cool vegetables, maybe some lettuces a little longer than you would, or certain herbs that don't love the harsh sun. It's also going to stay wet longer. But as you see this little curlicue here, the wind, as it comes over any kind of vertical surface, your fence, stone wall, whatever, the wind does kind of eddy there and can get a little wild. So you want to plant a little farther away from the fence to allow that to dissipate. There's some other practical considerations. First of all, what's the goal of the container? In this case, we're talking edibles, but you want to make sure that it's easy to access the plant. You're going to be pinching and harvesting and checking for pests and all those things. You want to make sure that you can reach it easily. It's not a stretch or in an awkward place. Also think about, are you trying to grow enough for, your family to have a regular crop for a month or two, or is it just kind of for fun and an experiment? Those are different amounts of planting that you need to do. And you need to think about the space if you've got it for the mature version of the plant. I mean, we all see the little tiny tomato plants out there for sale that are 6 inches. Well, those can grow to 5 feet by 5 feet, and they're happier when they have that room. Now, this is a couple of things. I love this picture with the little watermelon. They're just hanging off I think it's a tomato cage. I've grown cucumbers, zucchini. I did watermelon once, but we're really not hot enough for watermelon. Some of you may be in a specific hot, sunny, maybe place. Maybe it's a big cement courtyard or something, but mostly things like watermelon and cantaloupes, they're pretty hard to grow around here. But you can grow those things in a container. You, as I said, want to know your microclimate. And if you're in some of the cooler areas, you're on the coast, or I'm up by 92 and 280, so we tend to get a lot of fog. I can't really grow beefsteak tomatoes. They want heat. They want heat at night. And I don't have that for them. So I'm looking at dwarf or patio versions of tomatoes or cucumbers and that kind of thing that will work in my milder summer. Also in containers, you're probably better off going with some of the more dwarf versions, just for all that spillover, so you can manage it and keep it in the containers. When you get to the nursery, or as you're doing your research and you're looking at things that maybe they need full sun or they can handle part sun, and what do all those words mean? It gets very confusing out there, but basically full sun means you want at least 6 hours of direct sunlight on the plant. And for citrus, this is really important. The more sun, the better. You need at least 6 hours. If you can't get that, doesn't mean you won't get any lemons, maybe some limes, but you're not going to grow oranges. You're not going to get tangerines. You're going to really struggle with that. And part sun, I always think, is a misnomer. Part sun is still 4 to 6 hours of sun hitting the plant. Part shade is, about 1.5 to 4 hours, but no afternoon sun. Afternoon sun is the hottest sun as opposed to morning sun. Full shade is not really full shade. It's 1 to 3 hours of sun in the morning, or dappled sun, or some kind of little bit of reflection. If you've got deep, dark shade, maybe you've got some huge trees, that's when you get a container and put it somewhere that's sunny, like on your driveway or on the walkway or something. The last thing you might see for some things, more like fruit trees, mostly fruit trees or blueberry bushes, that kind of thing, is chill hours. And that's the number of hours the plant needs to be dormant. And so that's between the temperatures of 32 and 45 degrees. And that way it can, I don't know, sleep and store its energy to produce fruit and flowers. If it doesn't get those chill hours, they don't do so well. Most of the nurseries are pretty good in offering selections appropriate for this area, but you really want to take a look at what the individual plant requirements are. And for example, some blueberries might only need 400 hours and some might need 600 hours. So those are things you need to check out. So you've kind of done your research and you've decided you can grow certain things and you're all excited to go to the nursery. You've got the space, you've got the sun and the water. You need to look at the plants and, you can't take them out of the pot, but you can look at them from the side and really look at the roots, look at the leaves. Are they the right color? Are they growing in a healthy habit? Is there signs of new growth? I know what it's like to get there and you have your heart set on something and all they have are a few stragglers there. And you think, well, I'll just take it and it'll catch up. It's really easy to kill a plant. My feeling is I can do that without any extra help, but it's better to start with a healthy plant and go from there as opposed to, starting from behind the starting line. Somebody else will have more plants or they'll get a new shipment. Talk to the nursery and see when they get more plants or try a new variety. But I would really encourage you to look for healthy. You want white roots. You don't want them sticking out the bottom too much. A little bit is okay, but if there's a whole bunch of roots out there, that means that plant is root bound. And especially for our typical summer vegetables that grow so fast, they're putting all their energy into just a few months. If they're stuck too long in a small pot, I don't even know the right word. They're dwarfed in the end. They never really catch up because they've lost some of their growth time stuck in a small space. And you don't want a weird smell. If you smell rotten eggs or sulfur or something sour, those are all things to avoid. Some other things are signs of pests or rust. That's a disease. On citrus, you'll see leaf miner. That's probably what that is. And if you see it on one or two, that's a problem with citrus. That's okay. It doesn't really hurt the plant too much. I mean, anytime you're ruining leaves, you're hurting the plant's ability to absorb sun and do the whole process of making food. But a few leaf miners are not a big deal. If you see a lot, then you probably want to look for another option. For fruit trees, you want to really look at the root. This is called the root flare, where the roots first come out from the trunk. And avoid something that's circling too much, because as it grows, the trunk gets fatter, the roots are circling, and they can cut off the growth of the trees. So better to try to avoid that. I'm just trying to look at that one. I mean, possibly you could cut one small little root, but I think it's better to start somewhere else. And then finally, this is something that's overgrown. Really should have probably been in a potted. This kind of girdling, I mean, this is girdled roots, but this kind of thing is also a girdling that again limits the growth. Oh, and let me just say, I think I talk about it more later, but some plants don't mind their roots being loosened up and roughed up. A lot of bushes, perennial flowers, that kind of thing, you can be a little bit aggressive. So you might take a chance if the leaves look healthy and there's a lot of good growth. But there are vegetable plants that do not like their roots messed with too much. For example, beans, any of the cucumbers don't like it. I'm going to guess zucchini don't love it. So if you're going to get some of those and transplant them, you don't want them too root bound, because you're just going to gently loosen them a little bit at the bottom and put them in their new pot. You also want to avoid buying plants, if they're smaller, I would say even in a gallon, but maybe in a gallon, you still may be okay. But this was a 4-inch by 6-inch container, and it already has these peppers, and it's like, oh, great, it's already started producing fruit. That plant maybe only produced, that was my plant, a couple more peppers, because it never grew as much as it did. Once it starts producing fruit, it's not thinking about growing it anymore. The point of plants is to propagate their species. So a plant grows and its job is, I got to grow. I've got to basically make a seed, get it out there so that they go in the ground and more of my plant type grows again. So once they're thinking about this, and they tend to do that when they're stressed and it's stressed, that's what you want. The other thing, this is for flowers, but you know, it can be relevant, is if you're buying a pot of flowers to enjoy, many have a very specific short bloom time. I mean, it might be 3 weeks, 4 weeks, but it might only be, 10 days or something before it really starts to fade. So you want to be sure to get a plant that maybe has its buds, but you don't want something that's already blooming a lot, unless it's a plant that's going to bloom for several months. Maybe the flowers die, and like a petunia, and it produces more, or a rose where you can cut it and you'll probably get a second flush of, or third in this area, of more roses. So you need to know what the plant is, what its bloom habit is, but try not to buy it already this far along. You'll have a very short period of enjoyment. Selecting a container. There are lots of containers out there for growing vegetables. For some of them, like this was a rosemary in one of those zinc metal containers. They get really hot and they can burn the roots. So I don't recommend them. If you have metal containers, that's all you've got, I would either align it with coconut core, which is the stuff you see in hanging baskets, or we had some panels of styrofoam from, I don't know, some piece of electronic equipment that had been shipped, and we kind of cut that around to make a insulation from the heat. But that's one thing you need to think about with metal. Obviously this one's too small. I mean, it's great for what it is. These are big enough pots, both of these. It's just, you know, it depends on what you're growing. The glazed ones will hold the water inside a little better. These stone ones are terracotta. They lose water through the middle. So if you don't mind that, that's fine. The fabric ones that you'll start to see this time of year as sort of instant vegetable garden things, they lose water. You know, a lot of air gets in through the sides, so they evaporate. I've never, well, I grew potatoes once in one, and you know, that was okay, but I don't think I would grow anything that's going to have a big, deep root ball, which is a tomato or a squash. A cucumber, probably. I mean, there are a few of them that I probably wouldn't do. If you've got one, you want to give it a try, just make sure it was meant for vegetable gardening. Plastic, there's a lot of great plastic containers out there. They're light, they're easy, and especially if you start, that's the advantage of container gardening. You may start now, and one part of your patio is the great place to be growing, and then 2 months later, another part of the patio is better. You can just move it over there. You're not stuck with it in the ground in the same place. Other things that might affect your choice, the stone and the terracotta, while it does lose some of its moisture, it does retain the heat really well. But actually black nursery pots hold heat really well. They can increase the soil temperature by 10 degrees. And generally that's a really good thing in our area. If we had 90 to 100 degree temperatures all the time, then that wouldn't be a good idea. That would be too hot for the plants. They do shut down when it gets too hot. They kind of take a pause like everybody else. I don't like self-watering plants. I just don't know. I have tried to ask people who manufacture them what they're thinking, and I have two reasons. One, when you put your plant in those pots, your plant is very small. Your roots might only be 4 or 6 inches, and the pot may be 20 inches deep. Well, the water down at the bottom is only going to wick up so high. It is not going to get up to the surface. So those little roots really don't get that water. Two, especially with vegetables, those roots are going to grow fast and they're going to want water. And I have pulled out more dead plants where clients have had this kind of system, and the roots go in the water. And once they're in the water, they can't breathe and they rot. And as soon as they start to rot there, the rot goes right up through the plant. So it's a really sad, tragic thing when that happens. I've talked to other container gardeners who have businesses like I do, and they don't like them either for that same reason. It just doesn't, I think there's a very limited time where it makes sense, but most of the time it really doesn't. I don't think they're worth it. And if you think you're going to need to move your containers, you want to try to get a dolly or something underneath so you can roll it around, because they can get heavy. My other design advice would be these kind of containers that are taller than wider, you want to make sure they're either sturdy or in a place with not too much wind. Because if you've got a great big tall tomato with a cage, it's unlikely, but it could tip. So if you've got a good heavy pot, you know, that's going to keep it down, then you're fine. It shouldn't be in the wind anyway, but that's just something to consider. For edibles, most of the containers you buy for gardening are great. They're fine. If you're going to build a raised bed, you want to use untreated redwood, teak, cedar. I don't know how much cedar we have out here. That's a East Coast That's what they use in the East Coast, but they're all good. You don't want to use the treated wood, which, you know, has been that way. It's for fences and things so that they don't decompose, but they do have chemicals in them. Don't use a container if you don't know its history and you don't know what was not only grown in it, but poured in it or done with it. If you have containers, or maybe someone gives you some legitimate terracotta or plastic containers, you should clean them with a 10% bleach solution. That will kill any pathogens that might have lurked there on the surface. Plastics with the following numbers below, they leach chemicals, so you don't want to use those for edibles. You see on Pinterest and all kinds of places the cute little containers people use for flowers and or succulents, and that's fine for that because you're not going to eat it. But if you're going to eat it, you want to make sure that your soil stays clean. And then that last bit is for the metal containers that we talked about. Containers, the correct size is key. You do want to make sure that it can accommodate the mature size. And this is an issue you don't want to deal with growing vegetables. You don't really want to deal with it with growing too much of anything. I mean, if you're going to grow possibly a lemon bush and it's small when you start, you may not put it in a giant container. You might put it in a medium-sized one. And then after a number of years, if you don't want to root prune it to keep it at its same size, sure, then you're going to have to get bigger. But if your zucchini plant is going crazy and the roots are, have taken up all the soil, you don't want to be pulling that out to put in a bigger container. So think about the biggest size your plant might need. And this is really a very casual estimate of what would work. So peppers or eggplants and what they call patio tomatoes. There are tomato plants that will say they're patio tomatoes, and those are meant for small containers on a patio. So those could maybe handle something like a 5-gallon container nursery container. They might be happier in something a little bigger. They will definitely have their roots, filled up that whole thing before the end of the summer, but you could probably grow something in a container like that. I don't know that they're 18 inches deep, but just to give you a visual, rule. For tomatoes and squash, you really want almost as big as you can get. I read somewhere tomatoes in the ground when they're happy, they have some incredible, like 5 feet wide root span. So, and deep, really deep. Nobody's going to have containers like that, but they do really well in a big, in a big pot. 15-gallon nursery container, the black ones would be the smallest. I think bigger is better, and you will be tempted because the pot is so big to stick 2 tomatoes in that pot in the beginning. And I have done it over and over again. And by July, I'm already sorry because they're already fighting. They both are needing more fertilizer, more water. They're just not producing the way they would if they had their own space. You can do herbs, carrots, beets, all those things in a smaller container. Now, you don't want to forget the feet. You need your pots to drain. If you don't want them, and I'm just showing this one here on the left because that was a pot sitting on flagstone, which is uneven. So I figured it would drain easily. It rained, and like 3 days later, I walked by the pot and there was still, you can't tell, but there's a couple inches of water there and it hadn't drained out. So don't just assume because it's sitting on a surface outside that it's definitely going to drain. You want to put something under there. It doesn't have to be something purchased. It can be some old leftover pieces of tile. Maybe if you had a home renovation project, or little flat pieces of plywood in the corners, anything you have left over. I go to Home Depot and buy a flat of tiles, like small tiles that you might put on a backsplash or your bathroom. And those I just peel off and stick under. So if you have a lot of pots and you want to do something like that, that works too. Oh, saucers. Lots of people like saucers because they don't want the water to drain all over. And I can appreciate that. There's two things. One, with the saucer, you need to prop up your plant. You don't want it sitting in that water. That's sort of that whole thing with the self-watering plants, where your roots will go down out the bottom and get into the water, and they'll start to rot. We've had I had a client, we just pulled out 2 big bushes where the roots grew down out the bottom. She had them in saucers. They started to rot, and eventually they killed the 2 bushes. So you don't want to do that. The other thing about saucers is it only takes a 1/4 inch of water for mosquitoes to breed. And we have, West Nile disease and problems with mosquitoes. If you have a brand new, gorgeous stone patio and it's not sealed, and you definitely want to grow the vegetables, and so you have to have the saucers, you want to get a turkey baster and you want to suck out the water so it's not sitting there. And I know it's a hassle, but that's really the best thing to do. I think somebody's not on mute. I'm just not sure, but someone keeps popping up there. Don't. That is not for the bottom of your container. That's an old wives' tale. So I just, everybody still thinks they should put stone or peanuts or whatever. Well, there's something about the difference in surface tension that inhibits the full drainage. So actually the very bottom of where the potting soil is, soil's here. It's hard with this. The stones are here. And in between, this soil stays very, very soggy. But people think it's well draining. So they're watering and watering. You're ultimately overwatering your plants and they will rot. The other thing is you're just cheating them out of potting soil. They need that. If you need rocks or a space filler, maybe you have a very tall pot and you only need the top 12 inches for planting, then fill the inside with something, some blocks of wood, rocks, whatever you want, but then put a separate container inside so that it's got the sort of proper complete structure and boundaries, and it can drain through that. That's what you want it to do. You could put rocks on top as a mulch. I mean, I wouldn't do that for vegetables, but for other things, that's perfectly fine. Potting soil. You want to buy bagged, pre-mixed potting soil. There are recipes out there. You're welcome to go out and try them, but you don't want to take anything from your yard, your neighbor's yard, whatever. Maybe not even a planting mix, which they use for raised beds. Those are really fast draining things. But potting soil has the right nutrition, the right, air, size for air and water to go through it. Some of them even now add this mycorrhizal fungi. Some of that dies while the bags are sitting in the sun at the nursery, but it comes back usually with a little water, and once you've got plants put in there. And some of the, I'm saying newer versions, but really these have been around for a few years now, have amendments that help with water retention, which now with another drought on our way is really important. And it'll be things like coconut coir or Dr. Earth, which I haven't seen lately, but used to have some kind of like yucca juice or yucca pulp in his. And so those things, I found that some of them seem to really help. So you can add the coconut coir yourself into a potting mix, just buy it separately. You don't want your soil to be too wet and soggy all the time. It does need to drain. The other thing is some people like to add or ask about compost, and you could add a couple of handfuls of compost, but again, with the potting soil, if you add a bunch of compost, you're going to get that sticky, bad draining soil, and that causes a big problem. Also with the potting soil, you're not going to have diseases already in it or pests, and it's all nutritionally balanced. I prefer organic. There are a lot of good organic ones, and they're at a lot of good price points, although they are going up, I think, every day. The gardening industry, like everything else, has been affected by the pandemic, not only because access to things like nitrogen fertilizer or stuff to make plastic pots, all those kind of things have been rare. So prices have gone up for that. And then demand. There was a huge demand when the pandemic started where everybody wanted to grow stuff. So prices have gone up, but you still can find stuff at a wide range. My preference is to not buy one with fertilizer in it. If there's an organic one that has fertilizer and that's what you get, that's what you get. But some of the non-organic ones that have fertilizer in it may not have all the secondary stuff that the plants could use. There are two other soil blends. Well, there's really only one for growing edible things. You might need acid planting mix. It is really good for blueberries. They like acidic, and citrus actually kind of like it a little acidic. I might mix the two, a regular and a little acid planting mix. And the thing about, why do they need that is the roots for those kinds of acid loving plants can only access nutrition with at that certain pH. So it actually is something that matters. If you've already got something planted in the pot and you didn't do the acid mix, be sure to use fertilizer for acid loving plants, because that at least will help them along. For succulents, you want something that's fast draining, but you can use regular potting soil. You can add a little vermiculite is better, I think, than perlite, because perlite blows all over. Or you could maybe get some lava rock, that kind of thing. You can buy the premix blends, but sometimes I think they're more expensive than the potting soil. And as long as you do need to water succulents, we're not talking about those, but they need water once a week, once every 2 weeks. They are not a plant and ignore kind of thing. And it really depends, again, how hot, how fast draining. They do want to dry out, but they do want some water. Fertilizer. Organic fertilizer is kind of like eating healthy food versus, non-organic fertilizer, which can be like taking a vitamin. So they're both good, but I think one is better. Also, organic ones, it's really hard to over fertilize and burn the plant, which you can do with the others. Less likely to build up salts. And some of the organic fertilizers really They make the soil healthy as well as the plant. And it's really all about healthy soil. That's kind of where it all starts. So that's kind of what you want to do. You may not get as fast a growth as your neighbor who uses, one of the name brand non-organics, but you're also not going to get super stringy, weak, unhealthy growth. And you will get good growth. The only thing, you don't need one fertilizer for this and one for that. There are just a few exceptions. Again, the acidic, which is important. And this is a personal thing, but I really like starter fertilizers. These two are two that I have used because they have a little bit more humic acid, and humic acid is kind of like Gatorade. So with the transplanting, it's just giving it that little extra bit of quick energy to get settled. And these usually last a couple months, and then you'll add something else. If you do use starter fertilizer, when you go back to do it again, I wouldn't use that. I would use whether you do something just for a bud and bloom, which is generally what you could use for vegetables too, or an all-purpose, or whatever it is you choose to use. Towards the end of the season, especially with pots, some of that fertilizer gets washed out. So the soil can be a little bit thin. You may want to use some liquid fertilizers for the last month or so, and that's a personal thing. I know a lot of really serious gardeners who maybe do it once in a while, but you're busy and you forget, you know what, the plants are still producing. So I don't want to make it like you have to go out and buy that, but it's an option. And I wouldn't maybe even give a full dose. I might do 3/4 or something, a dose. They usually don't need all of that liquid fertilizer. So these are all good options. Planting. So there's just a few things, but they'll make a big difference. Water all the plants before you put them in their pots or in the ground for that matter. It makes a big difference. If they're really dry, water them and let them sit for an hour to really soak that up. They're stressed when they're super dry and wilty. You want to carefully tilt them out and not yank them by their stem or their trunk. You could pull the top off. You could, sometimes the roots are entwined in a bunch of heavier sandy soil. And I have had plants where we did that and lost half the root ball. So you really don't want to do that at all. You want to carefully kind of tilt it, push it, massage it, whatever it takes. Something really big like a fruit tree, you might have to lay it on its side and kind of roll the sides back and forth and, bang on it. And maybe somebody's gently pulling on the trunk while you're lifting it. That's the sort of exception to the rule, but generally you want to be very careful. You want to loosen the roots, kind of like you see here. I mean, they're actually loose. Especially if there's a lot of roots, they've kind of grown into that shape and it will take them a while to reach out. There were those exceptions. I mentioned, beans and cucumbers and stuff. I would not disturb them as much as that has been disturbed. I would be very careful to just make sure there's a few bits that are going out its, original shape, but and you want to tamp them down, but not too hard. I mean, in the pot, it's harder, but I see people all the time, they've planted something and then they take their boot and stamp all the way around to get all the air out, make sure it's in. That's really smashing. You don't want big air pockets, but you do want some air. So just use your hands. That's enough. But you're gonna loosen it. You're gonna tamp it down, mix in some fertilizer, really just the top 4 or 6 inches is probably fine. If you want, you can put some in the bottom. All those things about, oh, eggshells or fish heads and aspirin. I did try one of those. I don't think I did the fish head, but the one thing somebody told me, and I think this is true, is a lot of that stuff doesn't decompose fast enough to get to a usable state for that plant. Because it really has to go through a long process of decomposing and being taken up by all the microbes and life that are in the soil, and they kind of work with the roots to get it into the plant. That doesn't happen in a week or a month. I mean, it might take all summer. So if it's worked for you, or you want to try it as an experiment, that's great. But generally, I'm not sure that the science is there. I know there's one group in Santa Cruz that swears by it, and their tomatoes look great, but you know, I think keep it simple. You don't want to plant too deep. That's a big mistake people make. So you can kind of see where this bush, I'm not sure if that's a blueberry bush or not, when it comes out of the container, it's planted to a certain depth. That's the depth that should be in your pot, in the ground, wherever. You don't want it down so that water comes and gets around the neck. That encourages rot, and that's a big problem. So, you know, and similarly with that little guy, the line is probably up here. The only thing that you can plant deep, and I think it's on the next page, are tomatoes, not the grafted tomatoes. You may have heard of grafted tomatoes, and they've taken the rootstock from one kind of tomato and put it, you know, with the top of another kind. I guess it's for more vigorous growth, less disease, etc. But that graft has to stay above ground. So those cannot be planted deep. But regular tomato plants, they have all those little fuzzy hairs coming off the stem. Those will produce new roots, and that will actually really help your plant to grow faster, to be healthy. So you do want to plant those deep. We'll get to that next. You want to water it in well, make sure all the soil's wet, everything. I would recommend keeping the soil line, which is how much soil you've got in a pot, about 1 inch under the container if you have room, especially if you're going to be hand watering, because otherwise the dirt just falls off the edge. And you don't want to do this during the high heat of the day or high winds, anytime that's stressful. Either wait, or if you've really got to get those planted, it's now or never. Provide some shade or move the pots to a cool area under a tree or something, because they can sometimes just give up the ghost. Okay, so here's my picture. So if you get a tomato plant, it's a regular tomato plant, it's not grafted, and it will say grafted. You don't have to look for something tricky. It will say on its tag that it's a grafted tomato. Ideally, again, you don't have to do this. It's not the end of the world, but this just gives you some, you know, extra head start. You want to take off some of these lower leaves, and you just snap them off, or you could cut them off or something. And then you can plant, you know, that area where you snapped them off. You don't have to wait. You can just do it all the same day, the same time. The only other thing I think you should do is, you'll see a leaf, and then there'll be a new little growth in between. Starts as a teeny tiny little thing, and then it often grows into a new branch. For the bottom several plants near the ground, you should also, and here it is, just, if you can, snap it off. If it's a well-watered, happy plant, you should be able to snap it off. If it's a little tired or wilty, you may have to use a pair of scissors. But you don't want that growth down below. Couple reasons. One, these leaves, the original leaves, start to go down, not far enough away, and they hit the ground. So they start like this upright, then this starts to grow and they go down, they hit the ground. And it's that mix with the dirt that encourages pathogens and stuff to get into them. The good thing about potting soil is you're not starting out with pathogens. It's more an issue with the dirt, but it's a good practice. Second of all, I read a couple articles last year where if you take the suckers off the first few, you will actually get more fruit later on. You can once you've got the first few off, you can let the rest go. It's fine, but that's something to consider, and you can do it or not. I mean, people have been doing both either way. If you've got a plant, a tomato that's a determinate, most of the plants that we buy are indeterminate, which means they'll keep going as long as they can go. And in fact, if they're in a greenhouse or a really happy, warm place and they're taken care of, I just spoke with a woman yesterday who still has a tomato going from last year, still producing, and she lives in Pacifica, but she has a nice greenhouse, sunny, it's warm. So her plant is still going. But determinate plants grow fast, produce a lot of tomatoes fast, and then they're done. So it's sort of a one crop and done. They're great in that they stay small, those plants, so they're good for pots, and you can sort of get a lot of, I don't know, if you want to make sauce or something and you don't want to wait for 2 tomatoes, 3 tomatoes, whatever, you want to do it, have a bunch and do it all at once, maybe a determinate plant's a good idea for you. For those, you wouldn't want to start taking off too many of those suckers because all that growth is limited. So just to add one more thing to the mix. Oh yeah, and don't be swayed. I was really annoyed to see this in an advertisement. Well, actually, this was on HGTV. These cute little black planters, and they were advertising the containers from gardeners.com. But in there are, this is eggplant, this is pepper, there's some lettuce, there's some, I don't know, I think maybe basil. First of all, you're not growing lettuce when you're growing peppers or eggplant. They're hot weather things. Lettuce or cool weather things. Second of all, there is not enough root space for any of those things to be happy or any air circulation. And that can also cause, transmittal of disease, rot, all kinds of problems. So you look at those and you think, well, that looks great, but no, it doesn't. They're just advertisements that have been made to entice you. And then there are also these fads, the salsa container. There used to be the pizza container, but I think salsa became more popular. This looks like it should all work, but there's 2 tomato plants. There's 2 pepper. There's at least 1 pepper. I thought I saw a second. Regardless, that pot's probably for 1 tomato plant, really. 2 tomato plants and a pepper, all of them growing, let's say at a minimum, the tomato plants are small ones and they grow 3 feet by 3 feet, and the pepper only grows 2 feet by 2 feet. It's either things are going to die, things aren't going to produce well, or some other problem. The other thing about edibles is you often, with beans, peas, all that kind of thing, you will see in a 6-pack, which is what those are. There's 6 little cells, several plants coming from each little container. So what they do is they don't know how many of the seeds are going to germinate. So they stick several in each whole. They also know at the grower that people are going to buy the container that has the most plants in it. But the dirty secret is you can't really use all those plants. They're not going to all live if you try to tease them apart and separate them. Beans, peas, they don't like that. And I have tried all kinds of things. I've soaked them in water. I've, gently sat there for 30 minutes doing one little root ball. 90% of the time, it just doesn't work. One of them accidentally breaks or is not happy when it's replanted. The best thing to do is to take a pair of scissors and at the soil line, cut off the weakest one. Now, if you have 2 plants growing in the container in the cell pack, like beans that are pole beans and they don't need the space to grow wide, you could try just taking the whole little knot of roots, sticking it in the ground and see if they can compete outside each other. But generally, it's the best thing is to just cut the weakest ones. Same with, I know I said watermelon were really hard, but any kind of melons, cucumbers, if you've got a really big pot for squash or something, and there are 2, I would not do 3, but if there are 2 plants growing, you could put those plants, just leave them together in the middle of your pot and encourage them to grow opposite. And hopefully their roots will find their own spaces. But there's usually a 3rd plant in there that's much smaller. I would definitely cut it. It's hard. You want to keep it, but even just trying to tug it free agitates the other 2. So do that, leave that one to compost and get back to the earth. Set up your supports, your tomato cages, your whatever you're going to use, your trellis. And then generally I don't use mulch in containers. There's just not a lot of space to put the mulch in, and you really want to keep it away from the stem or the trunk of something. However, with things like squash or cucumbers, that kind of thing, I have done a layer of straw, which also will decompose over time, so you may have to replace it. It does a great job of retaining moisture in the soil. Don't have to have too much, and it seems to be kind of light enough to not trap a lot of water around the trunk. I mean, it doesn't move so much that all of a sudden you have a big mound of like wood chips up against it. So that is something I've used with some success. So if you're really trying to mulch for water retention, I would go with something like that. Keep it about, from the stem of a tomato, I don't know, maybe 2-3 inches all the way around. For a tree like a citrus tree, I would keep it at least 6 inches. I mean, I wouldn't be using straw, but if you really felt like you wanted to put some kind of a mulch, I would keep it about 6 inches away from the trunk. And if I was going to then be doing mulch in those cases, I might just use soil amendment. And that way, as it decomposes, it's adding to my soil. See, water. You have 2 choices. You can water by hand, which is generally what I do, especially because I have pots everywhere and it allows me to customize it when it's hot. And now, like today is cold. It's really a good way then to also check on your plants. You'll be the first one to see, a pest problem. It's good to do in the morning. And if you're going to do it, you want to keep the hose pressure low. You want to avoid mud splashes. You want to keep it low like this little demonstration has, but you do want to get all of the container. Irrigation is super convenient. If you're gonna do irrigation, those little bubblers or sprayers, I don't think cover enough ground. I really like, this is a drip line with a 6-inch spacing. So there's a new emitter every 6 inches. You can find it some places. You can definitely find it at Urban Farmer in the city. And they also have a great website with lots of information. And if you go to Urban Farmer, they will spend so much time with you. They are wonderful. They used to have classes. I don't know with COVID if they still do. You can bury these drip, but you want to be careful if you do that you don't accidentally cut them when you go to dig something up. But that's what I use a lot for clients. We wrap it around. I'd probably wrap it around like a spiral, maybe have another layer. If I thought something was going to get big, I might get it, a couple inches. You want it, the water, not up close, but right at the edge of where the roots are. And then you want maybe another bit of water just a little bit farther than that, because you're going to encourage the roots to then go out looking for the water. You also want it to go deep. You want to see it go through the pot. You don't need tons, but you want it to go through the pot. This is really, really important. Dry soil is afraid of water. Once that root ball dries out, you've got all this air in there, in between the pieces of dirt and the roots. And you go to water and water runs out really fast. And you think, well, wow, it must already be wet. But it's wilty and you don't know what's going on. Well, the fact of the matter is the water's just pushed it out. I mean, the air has just pushed it out down the sides and out the bottom. You really need to poke your finger in a couple of inches, make sure that you see water in the root ball or moisture. And if it's dried out, you got to water several times a little bit, maybe stick I was going to say a chopstick or a bamboo stick in a few places to open up areas and get water down in there. It can take 20 minutes for like a citrus pot. So that's something you really want to try to avoid. In general, for all these plants, they pretty much want moisture, but they don't want to be wet. And it's okay as they mature that if the top inch, maybe even 2 inches for a fair, as the plants go on in July, are dry. They don't need to be wet all the time. But lower than that is when you really want to water. So you want to keep an eye on that. Irregular watering is one of the reasons you get things like blossom blight. And for tomatoes, it's annoying because if they're too wet, you can get it. If they're too dry, you can get it. So you kind of need to monitor those things, realizing how late it is. Oh, succulents do need water. Maybe not weekly, but okay, this is a really helpful resource. Master Gardeners has a website. I've just cut and pasted a bit. And if you go to resources and you pick on plant selection, you'll get a page with a whole bunch of things on it, all kinds of plant things, including a section on vegetables and herbs. And there, if you click on one of these, there are 3 calendars of when to plant either seeds or plants for your vegetable garden. And so I clicked on the sunny one, and this is what comes up. So, we're in April, and you could do bean seeds. You could still do broccoli transplants, although when it gets too hot, it gets a little difficult. You can be doing, all these things. So this is great. And they are kind of inspired or taken off from this book by Pam Pierce, Golden Gate Gardening. It's a really great book. Ongoing care, we're almost done. You want to do with evergreen plants, your citrus, give them a good rinse. The dust actually attracts certain pests like mites. You want to rinse off the leaves. You may even have to take a rag once in a while. I know it's crazy, but we don't have enough water to wipe some of the dirt off. You want to turn them maybe a quarter every quarter or whenever you remember, so they don't grow uneven. And if you want to keep them in the same pot, you might have to root prune. Also, harvest your crops. If you let the tomatoes die on the vine or the cucumbers or whatever, it's gonna think that it's fulfilled its mission, because it knows that the fruit has rotted, has just, dropped its seed, and it can be done. You want to be pulling the fruit, so it's thinking, I haven't gotten to the finish line yet. These are a couple of good resources. I love the library. There's so many books, and Sunset has some that are really good. These are Master Gardener related things. This is on integrated pest problems, and it helps you figure them out. I have these 3 pictures because one of them is bad, and it's not probably the one you would think of. Well, you might. There is a clue in that picture. This is what a ladybug, not larva, but well, the middle stage looks like. So when you see this thing that looks kind of ugly, it's a ladybug. This is a soldier beetle. These 2 guys eat tons of aphids. So if you see them around your plants, let them be. These little cuties are cucumber beetle and maybe bean beetle. They look the same to me. They are bad. Not only do they eat the leaves, but they also spread disease. They're hard to catch. They tend to fall. So if you see them, and you can't sort of smash them between a leaf, get like soapy water in a bucket underneath and maybe shake the leaf. They drop thinking they're being sneaky, but then you've got them in the water. And this is the Master Gardeners. They've got, I don't think the offices are open yet. They do have a helpline, and you can call or email them with pictures and information, and someone will get back to you and help you with your problem. And I thank you. I know we're not over time, but we're running close. So are there any questions?
Thank you, Laurel, for an interesting and informative presentation. I think we all got some great ideas on container gardening. And we do have some questions. The first question is, when you're planting, instead of tamping, is it safe to lift the pot an inch or 2 and then drop it to settle the soil?
Yeah, sure. That's fine. The one thing I will say, for especially the bigger pots, like for a tomato or something, I will put the soil in and sort of tamp it a bit ahead of time, and then plant and water it down, because it's frustrating if you put it all in and then as you water, your plant starts to sink. So you kind of want to make sure you can lift it and do that and get the big air out, but you might also water it first before you put your plant in.
Okay, hang on, I lost my questions. Another one, sorry for joining late. Did you go over growing veggies from seeds?
You know what, I didn't, except to say that that last calendar did talk about when is the right time to do it. Some things really have to be from seed, and I would say there's probably some good books in the library, but I bet there's also some information on the Master Gardener. Things like a carrot or a beet, even though you'll see those as transplants, those kind of things are better off started from seed. Even beans, it's really easy to start beans from seed. They don't like their roots messed with. It's hard to transplant, so they're better off. And then but you might have to keep them protected so that there's a certain amount of moisture, and keep the birds away from them. So you can do anything from a gallon milk container, you cut off the bottom and take off the cap and have your own little sort of, terrarium kind of thing going for a while, or there's all kinds of things out there. but you do have to watch out for birds and slugs and everything else.
Okay, another question. Do you fertilize containers on a schedule or look for symptoms that indicate the plant needs it?
Both. I generally, I fertilize when I start, and then kind of assuming I don't see any problem that makes me think about that there's an issue, I will do it again whenever it suggests. And I'm not great about it. I don't put it on my calendar, but you can to say, oh, this is about time. If I see something, it's not always an issue like that blossom rot. I said, with the tomatoes, it can be too much water, not enough water. Well, you'll also read it could be calcium. But, if you've used new potting soil and a regular broad-based fertilizer, it's probably the watering more than you need to now go buy another thing. Citrus gets tricky. I think if you've got citrus long-term, you sometimes are dealing with those issues more, and you also want to find a good broad citrus fertilizer.
Okay, does the temperature of the water matter? I've noticed that the water is fairly cold.
No, but the new seedlings that you've just brought home from wherever, you may want to, if they weren't for sale in a place that was outside getting all their sun, you may want to have them out in the morning for, till noon, bring them in every day, maybe a little bit longer, get them used to the realities of life. Some of them have been in greenhouses or whatever, so it's a bit of a shock to get out and it's either hot or cold. That's kind of what I do. Or if you're worried about it being too cold at night, maybe at first you keep them by a window if you've just got a few, or you put them in a very protected place under a bush or a tree, so they can kind of get used to it, but it's not as jarring. But in theory, rain is cold. So they say you should do that. Oh, don't get water on the leaves. I know I said that, but these big sprinklers, you really don't want to get water on them. I mean, yes, in other places in the country, it rains and they survive, but you really want to try to keep all water down at ground level.
Okay, and there's a question, actually, this is on houseplants, so a little off topic, but why do my houseplants get small flying insects? And Linda responded, said probably too moist, might be fungus gnats, try mosquito bits tea for your plants. I try to bottom water to avoid the same issue. Anyway, did you have anything to add about that, Laurel, or?
It could be that. You can also, sometimes they just happen, even if you haven't done all of that. Now, with the bottom water, again, you could bottom water, but then you want to make sure the water doesn't remain there, because that also encourages them. You can also maybe do a layer of sand, I've read, because those gnats are laying their eggs in the soil. So you want to get rid of any dead leaves or pieces that might fall there. And you want to, you could maybe put whatever makes sense, a ½ inch in it, an inch of sand if you can. Then they don't have a place to lay the eggs.
Okay, thank you. Sue Carter posted that the Master Gardeners have a monthly plant clinic here at the Arboretum. Next one is May 1st, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. You can bring your problem plant or insect in a plastic bag for diagnosis. And then it looks like one last question. Can you grow alliums from seed in containers? I've had issues with them not bulbing or their leaves turning yellow before I think they're mature.
Oh my goodness. I don't know. I'd have to say, I really don't know, to be honest.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing I would go either, I would write to the Master Gardeners at that address there, or You know what? I'm also a big fan of the privately owned nurseries in the area. Not all of them have experts, but some of them, especially some of the family-owned ones, they have really good people who know a lot, and you could ask them. Also, if you're going to search online for something, because goodness knows I use Google all the time, the best websites, SF Gate surprisingly has a lot of good gardening information that is reliable, and anything that's an extension or a master gardener or a university kind of website is also a really good place for information. So you know, if you're going to look, there's a lot of wives' tale stuff, or I don't want to call it wives' tale stuff. There's a lot of stuff out there, but those are usually things that are a bit more science-based.
Okay, and one more question. Do you recommend fabric bags for tomato plants?
Well, the issue with those is, are they big enough? If they're big enough and it's a fabric bag meant for growing vegetables, not just a fabric bag that you made or got from a friend or something, you can try it. I think you're going to water more often. That's my issue with those. But, you know, I guess they're handy if you don't want to have a container in the off season sitting around.
Okay, so it looks like that is probably all the questions we have. So we'll wrap it up. And in a few days, you're going to be emailed a link to a recording of the presentation and an evaluation form. Any unanswered questions can be addressed at that time. We would appreciate any feedback you can give us to what worked and what we could improve on. Please join us for future seminars and workshops. On May 1st, we will have our annual hands-on pruning camellias in Central Park from 10 to noon with Jean Fleet and Meg Milani, who are both active members of the San Francisco and Peninsula Camellia Society. Check our website for additional information and to register. Pre-registration is required. Thanks again to Laurel and Kevin Wilkinson, our Zoom technical specialist. If you have interest in volunteering, you can email us at info@sanmateoarboretum.org, or you can call 650-579-0536. Thank you for joining us today. The program is now concluded.